My name is Ben Belitt, and I've been a member of the literature faculty here at Bennington since 2012. Really happy to see everybody here for the second Ben Belitt Colloquium on literary arts and culture. Aside from everyone who's here in Tishman tonight, there's an audience watching online, so welcome to people watching online too. President Walker is going to welcome everybody here. This is just an unofficial welcome. But first, I have a few announcements to make. Next week at 7 p.m. in Tishman, the first group of seniors who successfully completed a literature thesis will be reading at the same podium. This is really not to be missed. They're fantastic writers. This is Wednesday, May 22nd at 7 p.m. The following week, on Wednesday, May 29th, the second group of seniors will read. That's also at 7 p.m. And in between, on Saturday, May 25th, student writers who are not seniors will be reading right here in Tishman. So thanks to my colleagues Franny Choi and An Duplan for working with the SCPC reps to put these readings together. And now, it is my privilege to announce the three winners of the first ever Ben Belitt Undergraduate Writing Prize competition. This is a bit of a surprise. We put it out quietly that the prizes are going to be announced, but we didn't, want to make a big deal of it because we don't have the checks yet. We can't come down and give them to you. So you have to wait a little bit. This is a new first ever undergraduate writing competition that's open to any and all undergraduates enrolled at Bennington who are writing fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction. A group of 10 finalists was chosen by the faculty, which was really tough to make those choices. Everyone's writing here at a very high level. And then this year's Ben Belitt Distinguished Writer, Gia Tolentino, has picked the three winners. Each of the prize winners will receive a check for $1,000, which is a pretty nice payday. There is one bylaw, which is you can't use that money to buy cigarettes. It'll vanish if you try. Anyway, the winners are Emmett Donovan for his short story Cutting Close to the Power Lines. Blue Mahari, who is here, for 8 poems, including Swarm and After Rothko's Green, Blue, Green, 1969. And the final winner is Lily Sanders for her short story Madonna Mania, also here. Gia Tolentino writes of the judging process. All of the finalists for the Ben Belitt Undergraduate Writing Prize submitted terrific, original, memorable work. Each piece was a pleasure to read. What distinguished the three winners, Lily Sanders' short story about a group of friends in the aftershock of a sudden death, Emmett Donovan's piece about an intense friendship between two adolescents, Blue Mahari's poems of searching and excavation, was a sense of real precision in both thought and language. So congratulations again to the three winners, and thank you to Gia for judging. And I know those writers who submitted who didn't win are disappointed, and that's just the thing about prizes. When somebody wins, you don't. But honestly, the pool of the people who applied for this, it just made me realize once again why I'm so happy to teach at this place. You're just remarkable, remarkable writers. Okay, Laura, for the introduction.
Thank you so much. And congratulations, Emma, Lou, and Lily. It is so great. Congratulations. I am so looking forward to reading these pieces. So, welcome, all of you, welcome here. And welcome to you guys on Zoom. Ben Belitt, for whom this event is named, was an American poet and translator who taught comparative literature here at Bennington for nearly 50 years. 50 years. He published 8 books of poems, 2 books of essays, and numerous translations, notably of Spanish-language poets Pablo Neruda and others. His complete poems were published in 1998. We are gathered here today thanks to the generosity of the Winston Foundation. Nancy Harrell, who is an alum and who had Ben Belitt as a teacher, has helped to fund this and other activity and the prizes, and her husband, Jan Krukowski. Jan actually came up with the idea for the prize last year when we were talking to him and said, we would love to be able to fund a prize. So they are also funding this colloquium and other things in the Ben Belitt legacy. And we have been fortunate to have visiting faculty member Gia Tolentino teach a class in literary journalism this term and give a reading as the Ben Belitt Distinguished Visiting Writer earlier this spring. And I think the work that she read from has just been published in the New Yorker. The Winston Foundation also provided support for the undergraduate writing prize. So tonight we're here for the second Ben Belitt Colloquium on Arts and Literary Culture. Welcome Jericho Brown, who was our speaker, our commencement speaker, was it 2 years ago? Gave such a great speech. Jonathan Lethem, class of 1986, and poet Camille Rankine. Thank you so much all for coming. We are honored to have you here and eager to hear your discussion of the work and life of Reginald Shepherd, class of 1988. So thank you, Ben. Thank you, Winston Foundation. Thank you all of you who are here in this room and on Zoom. And now it's my pleasure to pass the program back to Ben to introduce Reginald Shepherd's work and our panel for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I think these are working, yeah. As you can see, we have some very nice chairs for all the panelists. Stackable and plastic. So not everybody here will know a lot about Reginald Shepherd, so we're going to spend some time talking about him and his work. We've had a bit of a preamble, so I want to get right down to the business at hand, which is discussing Reginald, I use his name familiarly because we overlapped in graduate school for a year. He was just a remarkable mind. Poet, critic, and essayist, and an influential early blogger. One of those rare visionary writers who aren't really understood until they're gone, who carry on a conversation with a future readership that's prepared to appreciate them even more, arguably, than their contemporaries were. Reginald Shepherd, was Bennington class of 1988, was a Black gay poet who grew up in the Bronx and went on to receive 2 MFAs, one from Brown University and one from the Iowa Writers Workshop. He authored 2 collections of poetry criticism and 6 poetry collections, all published by the University of Pittsburgh Press: Red Clay Weather, Fata Morgana, Otherhood, Wrong, Angel Interrupted, and Summer Drowning. His work has been widely awarded and anthologized and has appeared in 4 editions of the Best American Poetry and 2 Pushcart Prize anthologies. The Selected Shepherd, a new collection of his poems edited by Jericho, has just been published by the University of Pittsburgh Press, and we have copies of it here for anyone who's interested. Bennington in the 80s is one of the most mythologized periods of literary production in the US. I think Jonathan is going to be talking about this, at least in part, later tonight. Reginald Shepherd arrived at Bennington in 1980 and studied here with poets Alvin Feynman and Ben Belitt until 1983, when he took a leave of absence. He later re-entered Bennington in 1987 and finally graduated in 1988. But he has not been a significant part of the Bennington mythology, and this event is one way we hope to address that. Jericho, Camille, and Jonathan will all have a lot to say about Reginald Shepherd and his work. I knew him well enough to admire him and feel a little intimidated by the force and maturity of his intelligence when we overlapped for a year in Iowa City. I wanted to start us off by reading an excerpt from a eulogy delivered by my classmate at Iowa, the poet Lawrence White. Reginald was one of the best poets of his generation and one of the smartest of this era. The course of his life, born and raised in Bronx Project, exiled to Macon, Georgia, then rising up to Bennington and Brown and points beyond, was the stuff of an Oprah List memoir. The motor of that progression, his adamantine integrity that would not swerve nor stoop, was heroic in the old-fashioned sense. It brought him to glories and it brought him to calamities. But he was no cliche. His friends and those students and readers who were drawn to him knew he was a rare spirit. As one friend put it to me, what I love about Reginald is how cantankerous, bellicose, generous, and celebratory he is all at once, which is to say, how gobsmackingly alive. He never backed down from his truth, nor did he compromise on his integrity. Such a character has trouble in the social world. He didn't waste his time in social niceties, which often created conflict. Later in life, he had mellowed enough to wish he had been a little obsequious with those who would have done him favors. But he knew why he had been the way he was. And now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Jericho Brown is the author of Tradition, for which he won the Pulitzer Prize. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute for the Advanced Study at Harvard, and the National Endowment for the Arts. And he's the winner of the Whiting Award. Brown's first book, Please, won the American Book Award. His second book, The New Testament, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award. His third collection, The Tradition, won the Patterson Poetry Prize and was a finalist for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. He is the director of the Creative Writing Program and a professor at Emory University. Did I leave anything out?
No.
Jonathan Lethem, 86, is a celebrated author of 9 novels, 5 short story collections, 6 nonfiction books, and an array of essays published in such publications as Harper's and The New Yorker. His novel Motherless Brooklyn was named Novel of the Year by Esquire magazine and won the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Salon Book Award, as well as the Macallan Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger. Is there actually like a gold dagger on a plaque? He received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2005, and he is currently the Roy Edward Disney 51 Professor of Creative Writing and the Professor of English at Pomona College. We have copies of his latest novel, Brooklyn crime novel, for sale over here, for anyone who's interested. And lastly, Camille Rankine earned a bachelor's at Harvard University and an MFA at Columbia University. She's the author of the poetry collection Incorrect Merciful Impulses, Copper Canyon, and the chapbook Slow Dance with Tripwire, which was chosen by poet Cornelius Eady for the Poetry Society of America's New York Chapbook Fellowship. Rankine's honors included a Discovery Boston Review Poetry Prize, a McDowell Colony Fellowship, and an honorary Cave Canem Fellowship. She has served on the staff of Cave Canem Foundation. She's an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University and serves as editorial director for the online literary journal, the Manhattan Review, and sings with the band Mirror Mirror. Is this true?
We no longer sing together, unfortunately. The band broke up.
There was a breakup.
No, it wasn't. It was
She went solo.
It was amicable. Yeah, so. One of us went to Japan, and that was that.
Oh, yeah. Moved to Japan. So anyway, we have copies of all these writers' books at this table here for sale after the event. So, and I'm sure they'd be willing to sign them when you're ready. Okay. So let's get started. Jericho, I know you wrote a really beautiful introduction to The Selected Shepherd, which really, it seems to me, it tries to take sort of, create a sense of like the whole poet, not just the writer. And I think you're going to read a little bit from that, right?
Yes. Should I do that now?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm going to get out of the way, I promise. I'm just going to...
You're doing great. I just wanted to say first, I'm so happy. I just want to say hey to everybody. I'm just happy to be back at Bennington. I always feel like, you know, when they introduced you, Jonathan, they said a year. He said a year. What'd you say? Like
86.
He said 86 when he.
That was when he
there's
would
a
have
little trick
graduated.
to that, by the way.
But I feel like I should get a year. I don't know which year it would be.
I think that's a plea
But
for an honorary
I've
degree,
literally
right?
done 2 commencements at Bennington. and I've given readings here from every book I ever wrote. So I would like a year. And I don't know, maybe you can average all the years. See, they agree. I think we should work on that. I'm happy to be back at Bennington. I'll read to
2025, is that okay?
That's cool. 2025, any year would be, I would like for when people say my name, at least at Bennington, to just say any number right after they say my name. Because I feel like I graduated from Bennington, but okay. I'll read to you from the introduction. I cut a great deal of it, so I hope my cuts still allow it to make some sense to you. But it gives you an idea of the attempts that I made in putting the book together, The Selected Shepherd. And I want to thank Ben for putting this entire occasion together. This was something that Ben was going to do. Ben and Michael Dumanis, who is one of my best friends on earth. But Ben and Michael were planning to do this and actually held it off because the book wasn't out yet. So I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate Bennington for being so good to Shepherd. However necessary it is to introduce to readers a dead man, the effort feels impossible since you mean to honor him knowing that you cannot present him as he might present himself. Like his work, Reginald Shepherd was, by all accounts, never predictable. He was brilliant, a man who seemed to have read all the books you keep meaning to read. He must have understood this about himself, and at a time when aesthetic differences in American poetry were almost violent. He never shied away from a fight or minded starting one if the fight was about the art form he loved more than he loved to, this is a quote, the art form he loved more than he loved to, quote, watch music videos where at least one sometimes gets glimpses of shirtless guys with six-pack abs. As far as Shepherd was concerned, he had the whole of English language poetry on his side and on the side of his poems. Why not fight? Why not write a little more wildly every time you make a new book? In the essay, originally a blog post from early 2007, where he offers his vision of shirtless men, he also writes, quote, in the perennially popular death of poetry discourse, there's a consensus that people don't read poetry because it's too hard, too elitist. Another word that should be expunged from the English language. It's never descriptive, only pejorative. I've always thought the opposite, that most poetry isn't hard enough in the sense that it's not interesting or engaging enough. It doesn't hold the attention. You read it once or twice and you've used it up. That engagement I look for and too often miss is a kind of pleasure in the words, the rhythms, the palpable texture of the poem. It's the opposite of boredom, end quote. Shepherd continues to elucidate and extol the benefits of difficulty in poetry, and I think the best way to introduce this volume is to say that you are holding in your hands poems that are indeed, quote, hard enough. The question for poetry readers, the question Shepherd had for his readers, is whether or not you too are hard enough. Do you come to the poem to do the mind work it as such that by its last line you might experience the delight of having been made uncomfortable? Or are you reading to see reaffirmed in lines you already thought you knew, what you already thought you knew? I was around 24 years old when I first read Reginald Shepherd's poem Semantics at 4 p.m. in an edition of the Best American Poetry edited by Rita Dove. The poem itself does not identify its speaker as gay, but if there is a queer voice, I believed I was reading it. By turns sassy, ecstatic, elegant, and cosmopolitan in its knowledge, that voice is what led to me reading every book and essay the man wrote. While that voice is an unmistakable mark of all of Shepherd's work, his poem's concerns, too, seem to be consistent in every book. These concerns can be divided into 3 categories. In each book, Shepherd reflects the beauty of the natural world through an understanding of that world as endangered. In his first book, Summer Drowning, this endangerment appears in direct proportion to the fact of whiteness. And that endangered status matters all the more as the environmental elements often get presented as characters with agency. And I have examples from poems, but I'm sort of moving forward for the sake of time. The second concern of Shepherd's work, and maybe the concern that we can take to be his muse, is his grief over his mother, who died when he was 14. Shepherd's mother seems to be the trigger for much of the popular and soul music that appears in his poems, featuring figures like Donny Hathaway, Barry White, Otis Redding, and Sam Cooke. His mother had gone to high school with Otis Redding. His mother's presence in poems also allows for writing about his own childhood and how he grew up in housing projects in the Bronx in New York City. She is often characterized not just as a Black woman, but as a source of Blackness. And then I want to read for you a poem that gives an example of this that Ben thought we should share. It's called My Mother Was No White Dove. My mother was no white dove, no dove at all, coo-rooing through the dusk and foraging for small seeds. My mother was the clouded overnight a moon swims through, the dark against which stars switch themselves on. So many already dead by now, stars switch themselves off and are my mother. She was never so celestial, so clearly seen. My mother was a murder of crows, stilled black plumage gleaming among black branches taken for nocturnal leaves, the difference between two darks, a cacophony of needs in the bare tree silhouette, a flight of feathers scattering black. She was the night streetlights oppose, perch for the crows, their purchase on sight. Obscure bruise against the sky, making up names for rain. My mother always falling was never snow, no kind of bird, pigeon or crow. I love the end of that poem.
Thank you.
It's pretty nice.
Thank you, Jericho.
Years before in Fata Morgana, Shepherd writes of his mother, your body of brackish water, black, opaque, impossible to see through to the bottom. The final major concern of Shepherd's writing, a feature that I remember causing confusion and division when his name came up in conversations about poetry and poets, is his real-life erotic desire and love for white men. There are many Black poets and other poets of color who are in sexual relationships with white people, and some of them have written about this experience. But I can't think of any other poet in history who uses the poems themselves to figure out and discover how and why he became, as he refers to himself in a 1998 interview with Charles Rowell for the Callaloo Literary Journal, a snow queen. Rowell, do you continue to write about white men whom you consider to be beautiful in your forthcoming volume, Wrong? As his third book was called Wrong. It's my favorite book of his. Because your detractors would say that you are obsessed with white men. Shepherd, well, there would be some truth to that. Rowell, what does that mean? Shepherd, well, on the most basic level, it means I'm a snow queen. On a more interesting level, it means that Socrates and Lacan, among others, have told us that desire is an activity within a lack. One desires what one does not have. One desires what one is not. Desire is the mark, the wound of that lack. So I feel my own desire to be a particular case of a general fact, since obviously to be a Black person who desires white people is to desire something that one is not. And he continues saying, certainly I can look at white middle-class people in my neighborhood, for example, because I live in a gay, hipster, yuppie neighborhood of men who are very put together and attractive, very polished in their self-presentation. And I can think these men look whole and complete. They look to be one with their bodies. I've always had a sense of distance from my body, of not being at home in my body. And again, Blackness is an easy label to put on that feeling, an easy way to account for that feeling. And then I say, yes, of course, as a 46-year-old queer Black man with a promiscuous past, prayerfully present and future, who has never slept with a white guy, I wonder how this lack Shepherd cites might be appearing in my own life, since it hasn't appeared in the way that it did in his. And Shepherd uses the poems to wonder at this lack too. In Wrong's Nights and Days of 19-something, a poem I find wholly original and quite gorgeous, Shepherd glories in the fact of the white body. From that poem, pink petals of an asshole opening under tongue, pink cockhead swollen to bursting purple balloon. It caught in the trees. And a few lines later, he says, I never wanted him to ask anything of me but suck my big white cock. I come home sticky with his secrecies, wash them all off. You were my justice, just my means to sex itself, end justified by the mean size of an American penis. Woo! I literally tried to write woo, but I really, Shepherd is always clear about the troubles made by whiteness and about the fact that whiteness always arrives wearing empire and capitalism as its clothes. That clarity is all the more complex and fraught with the fact that he is also always clear about his desire. I want to write his Black desire for white men. I write about voice and concern because they are consistent throughout Shepherd's poems. What changes in each book are Shepherd's poetics, his influences, his thinking about the line length, his use of rhyme, his approach to craft, and his rebellion against assumptions about craft. Organizing this volume and selecting its poems was a matter of tracking these shifts and idiosyncrasies such that the reader might have an experience in a single book that I had over the course of 6 books. I always looked forward to the next Reginald Shepherd book because I wanted to know what he was thinking, not about grief or desire, but about poetry itself. I wanted to know how his poems would refute and expand the practices of his earlier work. And I wanted to know what poetic devices he was now using as a guide or a challenge. The poems are in the same order as they are in his books, and I can skip that. Of course, I hope these selections lead to a wider reading of these 6 books in full. And I hope that other Shepherd fans will read this book and be upset enough about poems I couldn't include that they post them and teach them and promote the books where they are included. We live in a world I do not think any of us imagined in 2008 when Reginald Shepherd died, a world that would indeed make so much more possible for him. But we know poets don't die. And if they do, people who love poetry can always resurrect them. Or as Shepherd himself might say, the minutes continue their shine, the shapes of color change and turn, a wind blows through my skin, and you renew the weather. I will not entirely die. I love that poem.
Thanks, Jericho. What a great way to get this started. So Camille, there's a really wonderful recording of you reading Shepherd's poem Paradise for the Poetry Society of America online. But you're here to talk about the essays because you know them well, you teach them, you think about them, and you have a piece of one essay to read, correct?
Yeah, I want to take a moment and read an excerpt, sort of a compressed version of his essay, Notes Toward Beauty, which is, it's funny, he actually starts the essay off with a line from that poem, I don't trust beauty anymore. So I'll read a little bit of this, forgive the compression of the essay, I hope it gets the spirit of him across, and I'll also talk a little bit about what it means to me. It is common to confuse the beautiful with the pretty, an ornamental irrelevance, to oppose the pleasing to some more exigent or severe realm above and beyond the merely beautiful. This perspective situates beauty at the midpoint of a continuum from the pretty to the beautiful to the sublime. Beauty is thus a form of mediocrity or compromise. It was Edmund Burke who first distinguished between the beautiful and the sublime as that which submits to us versus that which overwhelms us, that which could destroy us but does not. Immanuel Kant and more recently Jean-François Lyotard have elaborated on this distinction. In this view, beauty reassures and comforts. It supplies us with the already known, while the sublime crashes over us like the storm surge of an out-of-season hurricane. As Susan Sontag has observed, beauty is part of the history of idealizing, which is itself part of the history of consolation. But beauty may not always console. The beauty of face and figure torments, subjugates. That beauty is imperious. That beauty is human. The beauty that is human and the beauty that is made, art, Both raise the fantasy of possession. Our model of the disinterested comes from the beauty of nature, a nature that is distant, overarching, unpossessible. Beauty is insistent. It makes demands. It demands that we see it and acknowledge it, that we acknowledge our seeing, that we be changed by the experience. As Rilke wrote, beauty is the beginning of a terror that we barely able to endure. The terror that Kant equated with the sublime is synonymous with Rilke's beauty. The sublime is beauty's true face, like Zeus revealing himself to Semele in all his glory, like Yahweh whose back alone can be glimpsed by the mortal eye. Beauty is not kind or benign. It is a natural force, amoral, beyond good and evil. I wrote once that many of my poems constitute an argument between beauty and justice, and it has long been the fashion to oppose the two, as if the falsehoods of beauty were unmasked by the unsparing eye of justice. But I believe, with Elaine Scarry and many others, that ultimately, and perhaps paradoxically, beauty and justice are one. That beauty presents us with the possibility of things as they should be. Beauty is outside the bounds of good and evil, and yet it enacts a rightness of relation that has an ethical dimension. Stendhal wrote that beauty is the promise of happiness, though that promise is often broken. In that sense, beauty does embody virtue, as Plato believed, and demands of us that we embody that virtue. For who doesn't want to be beautiful? Who wouldn't want to be beautiful if he could? The presence of beauty reminds us of all its too frequent absence, and demands that we remedy that absence to the best of our ability, if only to salve the pain of lack. Again, in Rilke's words, there is no part that does not see you. You must change your life. The pain that beauty often induces, beauty is something we undergo, a passion, is the pain of the awareness of the absence of such a thing in our lives. Beauty's reminder of our own inadequacy. Rilke's archaic torso is, after all, a fragment of a god. Beauty shines out in what remains, reminding us of a wholeness just out of reach. It reminds us of the possible that does not exist. And I wrote a little something in response, because I'm terrible at speaking off the cuff, and I'm a writer, so I'll just read this for you in response to his essay. I'm drawn to this essay because I've long been preoccupied with this topic. Not beauty itself, exactly, but the strange pain that beauty brings, the beauty that serenely disdains to destroy you, and the sorrow you sometimes feel when in its presence. Over the years, I found myself collecting references to this feeling, and returning to Shepherd's essay after some time away from it, I find that some time ago I've marked his comments about beauty and justice. His words remind me of a time recently when I felt beauty's ache. At a protest, marching down a city street, as I watched a protester set off smoke bombs releasing plumes of red and green into the air, while before him a woman chanted through a megaphone, her voice cracking with effort and fatigue as she called again and again for justice. What made me ache at that moment? Was that the same feeling I had when I stood before the Grand Canyon for the first time and saw the strata of time stretching down and out and back and beyond me or you or any of us? I thought then about my own smallness and the immensity of earth and time and the absurdity of the systems men have built to control them. About a time before those systems, a time just barely clinging to our living memory. A reminder of our inadequacy, as Shepherd would have it, a wholeness just out of reach. I'm always telling my students that poetry's most exhilarating beauty lies in its inevitable failure. The signifier gesturing toward the signified. Poetry is failure. Unable to really say the thing, convey the thing, be the thing. It can only approach, poetry as asymptote, yearning toward an expression that never fully arrives. So maybe poetry can never truly embody beauty, can only move toward it, as Shepherd says. What is it, then, in a poem when a poem reaches us? What is it that brings us the same ache that beauty does? I wonder if it's the attempt itself, the doomed abandon, that does it. The tension this attempt creates as the poem grows nearer its axis of arrival, the ever-narrowing space between what is and what should be, what is hoped for, striven for, but never quite achieved, creates a vibrational energy, a resonant thrill within the reader. And what does this have to do with justice? This is where I return to failure. As a poet, I am inadequate in the face of a world fraught with injustice that I know my art is no match for. But reading Shepherd's words, I think, if beauty presents to us a vision of a just world, a version of the world where all is right, then perhaps my poetry can stretch toward that, a long arc, bending forever toward justice. And then I think again of the protester, haloed by smoke, shouting with the full force of her, with all the volume she can muster for liberation, though she knows her voice alone will not bring it. Her voice, in its straining and breaking, was not pretty, but it was beautiful. And why? In Shepherd's essay, the pieces I puzzle over click into place. She calls into the space between what is and what should be. Her voice reminds us of the possible that does not exist. I hope, as I imagine Shepherd did, that my own voice may do the same. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Camille. There's already so much to talk about. Jonathan, you've written something too tonight, correct?
I have written something. All of a sudden, at the last minute. First, let's straighten this out, Jericho. When you hear the word, the phrase Jonathan Lethem 86, you should definitely arch an eyebrow at that. Because although I attended college here, I did not actually graduate from college.
Oh, really?
So at some point, I got kind of swept up and they stuck a number on the end. But I didn't manage to attain the degree.
How many classes do you need?
I'm hoping
that right here.
I'm a sophomore on leave, so I've got a little ways to go.
Oh, okay, maybe not.
But I'm hoping tonight can maybe be credited.
Yeah. I mean, you.
So this little thing is called Notes on Reggie, and I'll explain why I'm using that version of Reginald Shepherd's name in the thing I wrote. In the past weeks, as this date approached, I've had to accept how this occasion remains disconcerting to me. That of being called here to somehow represent and offer up some fragment of knowledge about Reginald Shepherd in the company of those who studied his work and have a measured and enduring sense of him as among their poetic companions. I mean, of course, Jericho and Camille, but perhaps also those like your Professor Anastas and Alexander Chi, who's with us, hey, Alex, who entered into a relation with Reginald Shepherd as a peer writer in graduate school, or perhaps unknown others who sit among us here quietly who located Shepherd as a poetic companion of their own, perhaps as their teacher or mentor or colleague, perhaps only on the page, that relation which can be, as Shepherd often testified, among the most intimate. I come to you in another relation entirely, as dictated by circumstance. In what has become a series of glamorous humiliations, I've spent my life as a walking witness to Bennington in the 80s. That's how I knew Reggie, and in a sense, that's still how I know him. I find that I need to call him Reggie, and it may also be useful for me to do so, since it not only honors my memories of him, but testifies to my limitations as a witness. In his beautiful essay, What's in a Name, one of the last things he wrote, Shepherd says, quote, "A few months before my 25th birthday, I decided I was too old to be called Reggie. That was a child's name." Well, essentially, Reggie and I knew one another as children. Our friendship ended well before his 25th birthday. We knew each other when I was 18 and he was 19, and then 20. In that short time, we shared an intense friendship, one which ended in a cipher-like form of incompleteness, which was typical in some ways of my relation to this place at that moment, only more so. Reggie and I never spoke again. I read his poems sometimes, and I looked at his blog, but I lost the chance to intervene in our incomplete story, to risk making an adult friendship with him when he died. In the past few months, I've tried to make sense of tonight's invitation by pursuing a concerted study of Reginald Shepherd's remarkable poetry and prose, and by reading his blog from back to front, and seeing how it served as a proving ground for his 2 books of essays, and by reading his book of letters with Alan Contreras. In doing so, I've heard his voice both again and for the first time. I've absorbed the incredible accomplishment of the poetic and public voice as it is formulated in his work, and how it connects to that precise and formal and sardonic voice of his more conversational interludes in the blog and in the letters, and felt how those voices are rooted in and continuous with the voice of Reggie, the friend I briefly knew. Reggie seemed then, to me, to possess such a total and encompassing and assured writer's voice, even if every form of knowledge I now possess, and Shepherd's own testimony in his essays, suggests how much it was embattled and tenuous and still under construction, how much it was in that moment still apprenticed. This process of making a synthesis between my private version of 80s Bennington, which exists beyond the caricatures and marketing, and the commanding poet who has called this gathering into being, is bittersweet for me. I'm forced to realize that by never before writing about Reggie, I've been trying to keep these memories suspended in a realm of pure experience. Before I could even put these few words down, I spent the morning on Spotify, putting together a playlist of songs I associated with Reggie. I wanted not to be commemorating him, but to be back in the living room of Canfield, dancing. Reggie himself considers this paradox in his essay, Why I Write. I have a strong sense of the fragility of the things we shore up against the ruin which is life, the fragility of natural beauty, but also of artistic beauty, which is meant to arrest death, but embodies death in that very arrest. What a sentence. Goethe's Faust is damned when he says, "Oh, moment, stay." At last he finds a moment, excuse me, he longs to preserve, but the moment dissipates when it's halted. The moment is defined by its transience. To fix it is to kill it. Art is a simulacrum of life that embodies and operates by means of death. The aesthetic impulse is the enemy of the lived moment. It attempts both to preserve and to transcend that moment, to be as deeply in the moment as possible and also to rise above it. This is the inescapable aporia of art, that its creation is a form of destruction. The public Reginald Shepherd, who accomplished so much against such odds, and then succumbed to illness and died, has, despite my every tactical delaying maneuver, finally arrived to overwrite and supersede Reggie, my friend who was still alive to me in a handful of incommensurable afternoons on the Commons lawn, who danced with me ecstatically to the jukebox at the cafe. Is there still something called the cafe here? Who gave me his copy of Samuel Delaney's The Jewel-Hinged Jaw, which I still own. Who stayed up with me in Vapa, playing a psychedelic Furs cassette on repeat while I worked with a glue gun and lumber scraps on an all-nighter sculpture assignment. Because we knew one another under a spell of radically premature artistic and social self-assertiveness, a situation totally embarrassing to recall on the behalf of every person for miles around at the time, and because our friendship ended abruptly and jaggedly, this has been until now among the least plundered treasure of my memory. Thank you for inviting me to come join some stories of Reggie to the life of the poet Reginald Shepherd. I feel blessed to be here with you.
Thank you, John. Wow, three of you have opened up so much to talk about. I wonder where to start. Maybe first with you, Jonathan. You mentioned to me that you actually found some poems of Reginald's that he gave you when you were here, and they're in your papers.
I didn't do my homework. I should have found a way to get my hands on these. I think it's really like 2 or 3 mimeographed or photocopied, one or the other, probably photocopied, poems that he was circulating in workshops. I never took any class with Reggie, but I was in Stephen Sandy's workshop, and he was working with Alvin Feynman. And probably that is to say, I was in the intro and he was in the advanced. He was a year ahead of me in school here. He was a sophomore when I arrived. But he would show me, justifiably, proudly, the pieces he was putting in. And they were, I mean, as I say, I should have done my homework and gotten hold of these to send them around. I'll do it retroactively. He was so fully formed, and reading the beautiful selection, Jericho, in this book, I just felt the poems I remembered that he wrote as an undergraduate were so continuous with this work. I mean, and the work itself is so continuous. The voice is so adamantly doing what it's doing from the first book to the last. Well, it was already doing that in school here. And so these couple of poems that I not only I saw more than a couple at the time, but the couple I kept, fortunately, and reread over the years, they're consonant with this book. I mean, he'd probably be embarrassed to have them shown around, but he wasn't embarrassed at the time, and he shouldn't have been. I actually made a terrible mistake one day, and I said to Stephen Sandy, well, of course, the best poet among the students on campus is Reggie Shepherd. Like, it was just like anyone would know this. But he was Alvin Feynman's protege, not Stephen Sandy's. And I know this would never happen anymore, but there was some competitiveness between those two men. So that didn't go over too great with Stephen Sandy. I saw his distaste for my declaration that I was even competent to judge, right?
Oh, that's funny. Should we look at a poem? Or, I mean, I keep on coming back to this line from Notes Toward Beauty. What do I believe in which I at what time? Which seems to me like one of the central lines in understanding his work, right? So I guess maybe I should ask, what does that line mean to you, Camille, and what does that line mean to you, Jericho?
I mean, I think that I respond to that and thinking about his work because I feel like he could be contradictory. Like in one poem, he'll say one thing, and then like later on, he'll say the opposite thing. Like in the poem that you read, Jericho, he compares his mother to a murder of crows, and at the end, it's no crow. And even in the excerpt of his essay that I read, he talks about how he thinks of a lot of his poems as an argument between beauty and justice, but then he's like, actually, they're the same. So, I think that he was not fixed ideologically, maybe, in how he kind of, I felt like he was very solid and confident in his work, but he was also like, I'll change my mind. Maybe that's a different version of me feels this way now and this way then. And I feel like that's kind of one of the things that I see happening in his work, or even in one poem sometimes, like this constant argument with himself.
And definitely by the time of Wrong, although I think by the moment of the last book, he's sort of on to something else. But he becomes a very Stevensian poet. Like, he's clearly interested in Wallace Stevens's nothingness. And he finds that one way to achieve, which in his reading of Stevens was sublimity, right? And in order to achieve that sublimity, one must always, in the space of the poem, one must always be contradicting oneself. This is not a poem that gives that. This is an excerpt from a poem that's sort of proof of that. Special instructions to the spinner of webs, the knotter of strings, the weaver of cloth, the platter of nets, the thrower of ropes over chasms. Special instructions to the builder of bridges, the sticker of wounds and torn skin. You know, it sounds like the Emperor of Ice Cream. Do you know what I'm saying? And so there's a lot in his work. And I think he was reading at a very young age, reading poems and reading poets in this way, where they became for him the way we sort of contemporarily think of theory, right? The poems he was reading and the poets he was reading were the way he was thinking, well, this is what I will write toward. This is what I'll achieve. And I think that comes out in many other lines. You know, there's this line where he says that he himself finally got to be a myth, for instance, which is like, that's really becoming something, but it's also becoming absolutely nothing at all. Do you know what I mean? Which is interesting to me. I'll find it.
Well, you know, Ralph Ellison made this distinction between, for him anyway, the writers who were relatives, you know, like Richard Wright would have been a relative, and the writers who were ancestors. And for Ellison, you choose your ancestors, like your relatives you're stuck with, and the ancestors you choose. And I think, you know, the two of them had some similar ancestors. You know, T.S. Eliot, I mean, they're both very interested in kind of high modernists, and you know, Reginald's pantheon was, you know, Eliot and Hart Crane, and you know, poets of that generation. So I wonder, is that something that made his work more difficult to read at the time he was publishing, and perhaps that made him something of like a lightning rod, like what tradition are you writing out of? That's not yours, that kind of thing.
Well, I think the difficulty really has to do with the fact that he's not a narrative or a rhyming poet. And he actually is a rhyming poet, but not in a consistent way that he could fit with the new formalists of the time. But he's definitely not a narrative poet. He tells all of his business in his poems, and yet is not actually what we would think of as, I mean, there's some question about this when you get to the last book, but I don't think anybody ever thought of Reginald Shepherd as a confessional poet. I think the more it's hard to classify you, the more people call you difficult. So I think that's happening. But I also think that there is a use of leap in the poems, and of juxtaposition, such that you really have to be inside the poem to understand how it's moving. And sometimes the poems like to talk about several things at once, or one thing that has nothing to do with the last thing it was just talking about. And I can see how that might have been stressful to some readers, particularly at a time where, and my sense of this, I mean, I think I was coming into this late, but I definitely saw a great deal of it, but particularly coming into a time where poets were staking territories. Like, you needed your friends to be a poet. Your aesthetics had to be shored up by other people's aesthetics, and then because y'all were together, you were a movement. Do you know what I'm saying? And I don't think he could ever, I mean, partially because he was a loner in many ways. And he was a loner in many ways because he wanted to not only be difficult in the poems, but to be difficult in the world. You know, he would do, I mean, and I mean this, I mean, what I mean by that is, I mean, I think he thought of this as moral. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a Reginald Shepherd biographer. And I met the guy once. Do you know what I'm saying? But he would write negative reviews of first book poets. Like, why would you be doing that? Do you know, like, why would you be doing that to a person? Do you know? But he didn't think he was doing it to a person. And that's why he thought he was, you know what I mean? He really thought this, he was in his time, but he also wanted to bring something from the past with him. And he was excited about the arguments that you can have over a poem. And I think because of that, he was also excited about making poems that weren't interested in didacticism, that could bring up argument in the mind. And I think that's what the difficulty is about when they talk about Reginald Shepherd's.
And when you're blogging, you can carry on the argument like at all hours, right?
Well, it's also, you know, that blog, I mean, for me at least, when I was a young person, you know, when you're a young person and you want to be a poet and you don't have a book, I mean, you know, after you have a book, you're like, I just want to get married. You know what I mean? I would like to make love sometimes. But before you have a book, you just want a book. Or I did. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so you spend a lot of time, or at least I did. I mean, if a poet, my friends make fun of me because I'm always like, what am I going to wear to this reading? And the only reason I worry what I'm going to wear to a reading is because of social media. Now, it is true, nobody's really tracking what I wear to readings. But if I had had social media when I was trying to be a poet, I would have been tracking what a poet. I bet you I can tell you what Jory Graham was wearing when she interviewed Bob Haas. And I saw that on YouTube. I wasn't there. Like, I know what poets wear. I know all of Louise Glick's wardrobe. So I'm saying that to say that blog was like Louise Glick's wardrobe. Louise Glick, by the way, had great taste and only wore high-end stuff. She would be wearing like $20,000 sometimes, and you wouldn't know because it was kind of, I'm sorry, she liked Prada. She did. Anyway, but the point that I'm really trying to make is that the blog became for me an education, because at the time, the blog was how you learned what, if a poet had a blog and they were talking about poems, you felt like you were in somebody's class that you otherwise would not get to be in. So I love that blog. And I very distinctly remember being in graduate school and fighting with my friends and having long conversations with my friends. Like Reginald Shepherd would write a blog post and we would call each other and talk about it. And so it became a kind of center for poetic idea, that blog, I think. And then, yes, it would end up being his essays.
It's also,
for the next
I was
book.
going to say, it's also a school in revision, because it's the most revised blog that ever existed. Openly, he'll pull sections forward and say, I'm going to rework this part now, which is crazy for a blog. Blogs don't do that, right? They move on. They bury it in the flow. And he kept pulling the pieces back to the top and revising them, which was like a kind of school.
And he was always interacting with the people who would comment on the blog, especially with people who were disagreeing with him. I mean, people would write in and, leave a comment. People would say, you're all wrong about Swinburne. Do you know what I mean? And he would come back and he would say, no, I'm right about Swinburne, and let me show you how. And therefore, he would have yet another blog post in this argument, And it's how he was making work happen. Which I think for me, became an example of how I could make work happen. I mean, I would be in a workshop and my teacher would say a dumb thing and I would think, oh, I'm gonna write a poem that disproves this dumb thing my teacher said. You know what I mean? My teacher was Tony Hoagland, man. He was always saying dumb things.
I do wanna open things up soon for questions for everybody else, but there's one thing, one thing that struck me in preparing for this was that if you look at the first line of the first poem in Reginald's first book, it's about his mother, and it goes, I started to write a song about you, then I decided no. And then he proceeds to write this beautiful poem about his mother. So you already, you read one poem about his mother, and then there's a later one that I know you like, because I've heard you talk about it on the podcast, and I think I could project it if I go up here.
Oh, sure, project it.
Hold on a second.
I like this when he's talking about his mom, though. I'm always like, whoa.
Maybe I can't project it.
Oh, that's too bad. We got excited.
I know. Oh, there we go.
Oh, it's a lot of poems. Oh, wow.
I know, we didn't get to them. I can get to, there's one more coming. My mother dated Otis Redding.
Oh, isn't that something? My mother dated Otis Redding. My mother is laughing in the hallway with her friends I don't like much. Maybe the numbers runner who gives me dollars to go see movies while they fuck. A mattress propped in the doorway where there's no door. I know what's fuck and dick and pussy. They're tipsy, she says. They're having a good time. Don't I deserve a good time now and then? I'm looking through the telescope I just got from a catalog while they break out the Tanqueray. I don't know what that is. They're putting on some records. It's 1970, Nixon's president. There's a dock in one song, and I don't know how to whistle, but I know what's a dock and a bay. There aren't many stars because of the street lights. It's the Bronx. The singer sounds sad. He's dead. My mother says, you know, I went to high school with him back in Macon, and everybody says, I'll bet, and she laughs. And I wish I was his son. I wish they'd all go home. It's late, and I just want to go to bed, but she just wants to have a good time. I turn my telescope on the Puerto Rican couple fighting, kissing in a window across the concrete courtyard. 3 parrots escaped from the loading dock, freezing in a trash tree. It's November. Neighborhood kids throwing rocks at each other from bicycles. My mother standing in the hallway with a paper cup of Tanqueray, or lying in the hallway in a pool of her own shit. He wrote that.
That's just devastating. But, you know, Jonathan mentioned the fact that he's constantly revising the blog post. It seems like he's constantly revising his poems about his mother until he gets to this one, right?
Yeah, this is sort of, I think, this is a poem. The poems about his mother in particular in the last book are this great and very hard, I think. And there's a way that he is more directly dealing with the love that's also colored with this feeling of having been neglected by the mother, or simply having had a mother who was indeed a poor Black woman. What I love about this poem is that it does so many things at once. Like, it's a poem about his mother. It's also a poem about Otis Redding. It's a poem about a song and sort of about a young person coming into an understanding of beauty through song. And I really love how this poem ends up being a comment on housing projects. He's very aware. He would have written this in 2006, 7, or even 8. And he's very aware by that time that the way these housing projects were put up were absolutely racist. There were no doors on any of the closets, no doors on any of the rooms, including the bathrooms. Many housing projects in the late 60s and early 70s would go up without doors on the bathrooms. Part of the reason why he's mentioning that Nixon is president, he doesn't like Nixon. So I'm taken with that. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on this poem from our panelists?
I mean, I find it, it's an incredible poem. I think the fact that the ending especially, like that landing is just so surprising. And I think that it's, again, an example of like that complexity you're talking about, like that there's just such a complex gaze that is love, but also kind of, what is the other word I'm looking for? Like, it's a critical gaze, but one that is also full of love. And I think that I see those poems again and again, and I see that kind of him grappling with that mixture of emotions. And this one, to me, is just such a stunning example of that.
Yeah, and there's also this thing happening with the hallway. My mother is laughing in the hallway with her friends. Then at the end of the poem has, it is very surprising, and yet inevitable. It also is letting you know just how cramped space is. Like, what is a party in one of these places where the party is happening in the hallway, right? Then at the end of the poem, my mother's standing in the hallway with a paper cup of Tanqueray, or lying in the hallway in a pool of her own shit, right? That all of everything that has to happen, but in this sort of in-between place of the hallway.
Well, why don't we open things up to questions now?
I don't deserve it.
We have a little bit of time. I can ferry the this microphone around. Questions for our panelists about Reginald Shepherd, his work, his essays.
Wow, that's a workout. That question up there. He's gonna. If y'all got questions up there, raise your hands now.
I guess this is more of a speculative question in terms of like insight into the structure of his poems. But I think it's really interesting how he speaks about his poems as a form of like immortalization of himself as well. And I wonder if the constant shift in the thesis of his poems could also be indicative of an unwillingness to kill the subject. I think that one of the things that is so striking to me about his work is that this state of argument is part of what keeps it alive. And that seems to be a common theme in a lot of his work, including his blog posts, like constantly engaging with the subject and elaborating on it. And so, I don't know, I'm just enchanted with his argumentative nature being part of why he so successfully immortalizes what he says, because it makes you actively engage with it in such a way where even now that he's gone, it's still an ongoing conversation with him. His work grabs you by the collar and like challenges you to a fight, and so you're still engaging with it and elaborating on it. And yeah, I don't know, the constant state change feels like it gives it its own life, and I just think that's enchanting. So that's not really a question, I'm sorry.
I like that though. I mean, I think that the idea of it, that element of his work and his being, like that constant argument being a part of what makes it alive, it's like it can't be captured or summarized or collapsed. And I do feel like for me as a writer, like I first encountered Reginald Shepherd when he spoke at my MFA program, like in, I don't know, 2008 or something like that. Well, I mean, it must have been like 2007, 2008. And I remember at that point, like feeling one way about what he was saying, and he was talking about identity and poetics, and kind of his reluctance to, or his frustration with the idea that you had to be like one kind of person in a poem, you had to categorize yourself as this kind of person in a poem. And I remember identifying with it in a certain way then, and then later feeling an argument with it, and then coming back to it again and thinking differently about it, and constantly my own evolution kind of arguing with what he was saying in the same essay. So I feel like there's always, in his poetry and his essays, there's so much agility and movement of idea that there's always something to discover and offer and challenge yourself or argue with. And it's so, I think that thinking about like the idea of trying to make a moment stay, like his work is never staying still. And so that is a part of, I think, what makes it survive.
Thanks for coming and coming back to Bennington. I don't personally find anything funny about a black person falling in love with a white person, but it was interesting how much laughter that produced, that setup. It occurs to me too, when you went into the Burke Sublime and the Beautiful, that Burke in that essay really posits beauty as a white thing and sublime largely as a black thing, the shock of seeing a black woman, for example, in that, which I find interesting vis-a-vis the other things that you've brought up. But I guess my question is a little bit like, I mean, he dies in 2008, Obama becomes president, our first black president who has a white mother and a black father. And I just wonder what, in this sense of him as being controversial because a Snow Queen, or because those aesthetics are there, I just wonder what you all think that gives us about him. I mean, are we still in that moment of what's controversial about him is his professed love for, as a gay man, for white men? Are we beyond that? Is that in the aesthetics? Is that part of the argument? Just anything you might want to say about that? I would love to hear.
I mean, I think it's in the poems. I think when I was reading that essay and reading his poems, I feel like, I don't know if it's like what's still controversial about him, it was, but I think it's interesting because he's engaging with that preoccupation in his work a lot. And I almost think that when I was spending time with this essay and with the poems, that maybe he's an argument not between beauty and justice, but notions of white beauty or white notions of beauty and justice. Like maybe that's the argument that I'm seeing again and again in his work. So I don't know if it's controversial still that's designation as a Snow Queen, but I think it's relevant because his work makes it relevant.
I think the phrase Snow Queen is, I think the phrase Snow Queen is funny, and that's why people were laughing, because it just sounds funny. It does. And I think, I don't think even according to Shepherd, and there's a poem actually in the first book, which in this book is probably maybe the third or fourth poem. But there's a poem in the first book where he talks about seeing in a library a black boy reading a book and thinks to himself, I should be able to fall in love with you, but I can't. And I need to admit to myself, I need to stop pretending it's because I imagine that you can't read. Do you understand? Which I think is good writing because it definitely excavates the self and one's ideas that one is having about one's own color or one's own race, as well as the race of one's own people. But I think calling oneself a Snow Queen is not the same as falling in love with a white person. It's actually saying, I will only love a white person, which is a different distinction. And I will not love anybody else, which is a different distinction, which he admitted to and had questions about throughout the poems and even in that interview. And no, I don't think it's I think, again, we're talking about a different time and people staking claims. We're also talking about a period of the invention of all these collectives, all of these workshops. And many of these workshops were based on identity, like Cave Canem, for instance, right? So part of what's happening in the moment is you are talking about poems with me, my black self is talking about poems with black friends, and we're reading. And there was a time I would call my friends and talk to them on the phone because we would have read all of the books of poems by black people in a year. You used to be able to I can't do that anymore. And I'm supposed to not miss it, but I kind of do, you know what I mean? But you used to read, if you were a poet and you were black, you could read every black person's poems. Like you could read all of the books that came out. You could keep up, you know what I mean? And so that meant we were gonna read Reginald Shepherd. And when you're reading Reginald Shepherd and you're black and he's telling you all I can see are white guys, yeah, I don't think anybody white cared about that. So I don't think it was a controversy per se, but I do remember it coming up as like, what's up with that? Like, why are we invested in you and you can't be invested in us, was the feeling.
I'm projecting the gods at 3 a.m. right now, just to help the conversation.
Oh, I like that poem too.
That's such a great poem.
It's so good. The gods at 3 a.m. I'm just reading Reginald Shepherd poems now. The gods at 3 a.m. And for some reason, I don't want to read them from the book. I want to read them from the screen. The gods at 3 a.m. The foolish gods are doing poppers while they sing along. They're taking off their white t-shirts and wiping their sweat from their foreheads with them. The gods have tattoos of bleeding roses on their shoulders, perhaps a pink triangle above the left nipple. There's hope for them. The gods are pausing to light cigarettes while they dance. They're laughing and sharing private jokes while the smoke machine comes on. One of the gods told you they put talcum powder in the artificial fog, then walked away. How could anyone breathe talcum powder, but it makes their skin shine with the sweat and smell of cigarettes and obsession? Don't try to say you didn't know the gods are always right. The statues told you that. The gods don't say hello, and when you ask them how they are the gods, they say they don't know. The gods are drunk and don't feel like talking now, but you can touch their muscled backs when they pass. The gods in backwards baseball caps say, free love. They say, this is the time, and disappear into another corner of the bar. They're always moving to another song. The gods with their checkered flannel shirts unbuttoned under open motorcycle jackets, hard nipples, and ghost white briefs above the waistbands of their baggy jeans say, get here. The gods say, soon, and you just keep dancing because you don't know the words. You hope the gods will notice small devotions and smile, maybe a quick thumbs up if you're good. The gods whose perfect instances of bodies last only for the instant or until last call, and then they disappear into the sidewalk. Gods who are splendid without meaning to be. Who do they need to impress? Say, this could be the magic. They say, live for tonight, and then the lights come on. And then there's also, I'll just read this. I'm not going to read the whole poem, but he says in another poem, this is from the first book, something my own to sing and not to live by white men's myths, not to reject those two clear eyes, but not to long for them, to see through their blue distances, all colors but my own. So he is questioning his own desire for white guys or his own way of seeing them. In another poem, when he talks about, he literally talks about he's talking about the destruction of the world and blaming it on white people, but then also saying, well, then why do I keep trying to sleep with them? Do you understand what I mean? And I'm interested in that, particularly at a time where, in criticism and theory in English literature, one of the writer in philosophy too, the Black pessimists, one of the critiques of the Black pessimists is that they all have white partners. It's like you're saying all of this about Black this and Black that, but when it's time for you to fall in love, that's with somebody white. What does that mean? And they never speak to that directly, but at least Shepherd is trying to speak to that in a direct way. And I have a lot of respect for that. I'm interested in that, actually.
I'm just going to add one other thing, which is that, this isn't so exemplified in the poems or the moment that you just read, but there are a lot of also very aggressively hostile, dismissive, like frat boy jokes. Like there's a way in which he's encircling this part of himself also and being like, it's funny and it's something that he's also using as a kind of power of dismissal. Like his desire is very powerful. His desiring eye was a superpower. And if he turned it away, then you were just a frat boy exiting the space. And he would dismiss these characters from the poems too.
I like in this poem also that the speaker's dancing, and then you were talking about him dancing.
He loved to dance.
Yeah, and there's actually a lot of dance. I didn't think about it until you were talking about it, but as soon as you said it, it became clear to me, like, he's always dancing in these poems, which is great.
I'll send you the playlist.
I really want to hear it.
Hi, my question is for Jonathan. As a current student, I'm wondering, when you were a student here at Bennington, did you have a sense of the success that Reginald Shepherd would have? And
say that last part again.
Did you have a sense of the success that Reginald Shepherd would have? And do you have like a memory or a moment that you realized who he would be?
Well, of course, the first answer is how could I imagine anything like this exactly, or a string of amazing books. But if there was anyone for whom I might have projected it, I mean, this is one of the defining things about the writer that you encounter it in this and in the blog, and the person that I knew, the kid that I knew, was raw, unembarrassed ambition. He wanted to be great. He even has an essay about precisely the staring it in the eye and not hiding it, that he wants to write great poems that will be remembered forever. He worries over whether he's getting there, or what it will consist of, or what it will take from it, require of him. And that was already true. So, this place at that time had a lot of big personalities in it, and he was absolutely one. And divisive, confrontational. Some people would be like, "Oh my God, can't deal with that," but he was, and I mean, the fact that I upset another professor by praising Reginald's poems can tell you that he was just he was kind of a torch of ambition and assertiveness. He wanted to be seen and reckoned with, for sure.
Can I also say success is such an interesting word, because I agree completely with it in terms of Shepherd himself. But I do think, at least my reading of poems in the last book, I do think he questioned that. He made decisions that would ultimately lead to him losing tenure-track jobs. It was hard for him. I have questions, to be honest with you, about, in a world where we're always getting diagnosed and good medication for things, whether or not he should have been getting diagnosed and good medications for things. Because of how often he could be confrontational and how it would cost him a great deal. But at the same time, I think that success is real, not just because of a great list of publications. I mean, in terms of like, oh, where are your poems? People stand up and you introduce them and you say where their poems are, and people go, oh, well, I guess you're the real thing. I think the poems themselves always made him feel that he could indeed take those kinds of risks. When we talk about his ambition, he really believed he could. I mean, a lot of us don't believe this. We do not think that we can act an absolute fool with people and still someday after we die, folks are talking about our poems at Bennington. Do you understand what I mean? And so he believed that the poems would save him, because I don't think he was under the impression that his personality would. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, he was willing to get in trouble a lot, I think.
Well, thank you to our three panelists for being here to talk about Reginald Shepherd's work. Thank you all for coming. This has been a great night. Taha Kadir, a poet, another Bennington poet, the next generation of Bennington poets is going to be here selling books. So feel free to come down, buy a book, get it signed by our panelists, and thanks again to everyone.